So this is an emotional story. So if I get emotional, please forgive me. And this is the first time I will have told this story that I've been working on for the last 11 years in this way. So I'm honored to be here at the American Library and looking forward to seeing what you think. Okay, so my story begins in the hot, very hot summer of 1787 in Philadelphia, one of those moments when the history of an entire era could be written. Now, the 55 men who gathered in that city between May and September were not trying to make history, but to put out a fire, because the newly independent United States was in crisis and holding on by a thread. Less than a decade had passed since they defeated the armies of King George, but the government they had created in its place was not working. The Americans, having freed themselves from tyranny, swung in the opposite direction, a highly decentralized system governed by Articles of Confederation, under which each state could issue its own money and make its own laws. Now, this had led to some exciting experiments, including in the state of Pennsylvania, where, guided by Benjamin Franklin, inspired by Native American traditions of deliberation, common people were participating in making the laws of this new republic. Many of those laws actually were passed to protect people like those common people, like themselves, from crushing debts that had accumulated during the war with England. But creditors didn't see it that way. And where poor Americans saw justice, those with money and property saw anarchy. There were protests, there was violence. The new country was coming apart. So the 55 delegates from 13 states, principally gentlemen, led by the diminutive and brilliant James Madison, were sent to Philadelphia to fix it. But what kind of government would America create? Now, I want to take you a bit further back to the golden age of the classical world. Now, if you took a time machine to the Mediterranean world in around the 5th century BCE, now what would stand out? Well, first you would see the already very ancient capitals of Egypt and Babylon. You would see the shining new Parthenon on the Acropolis of Athens, center of a new and prosperous empire of city-states, inventing new forms of philosophy, tragedy and comedy, medicine, sculpture. And if you looked west, you would see Carthage, an old Phoenician colony, now center of its own empire. Sicily, with its very rich Greek-speaking cities, the venerable Etruscans in the north, and then in between, a bunch of marginal people. Simple peoples you could basically wave at: Volscians, Veians, Lucani, Romans, Samnites. This is where Rome stood in 400 BC, a tiny village of soldiers and pig farmers, simple, negligible, unremarkable. But as the great empires kept their focus on each other, the Macedonians, Persians, Egyptians, Roman territory began to grow. Their neighbors in Italy came to learn that they weren't, these Romans, as simple and unremarkable as they looked. Yes, they were very tough fighters. Yes, they were extremely religious, but that wasn't so unusual in the ancient world. What was remarkable about the Romans wasn't that they never lost a battle. What was remarkable about the Romans was that whenever they lost, they would take whatever strategy or technology that had beaten them, appropriate it, and come back the next year and win. Here's an example. In 264 BC, Rome was in a fight with Carthage. Now, Carthage is an ancient naval power, and Rome has essentially no navy at all. After an embarrassing defeat, Romans are able to capture one Carthaginian ship. They study it, they take it apart, they analyze it, and they build a fleet. And within 2 years, the Romans are winning battles at sea. So this is the kind of people we're dealing with. The Romans had basically no talent for invention, but they were the greatest assimilators in the history of the world, and they refused to quit. Now, their politics were also, by ancient standards, very, very strange. In the Romans' own telling, they had been founded as a monarchy. Their first king, Romulus, had gathered the oldest men of the village, the senes in Latin, and made them a council, the Senate. But then a successor king named Tarquin abused his power. His son raped a young noblewoman named Lucretia, and he was overthrown. Again, not unusual for an ancient king to lose his throne. What was unusual was that instead of a new king taking his place, the Romans decided they would never again let one person have supreme power. Their public affairs, res publica, would be managed by the most deserving members of the community, chosen by the entire community, and taking power in turns. Rome's republic would be led by 2 consuls and a range of magistrates elected for 1 year only, and advised by the Senate, from whose ranks the magistrates would come, and to which they would return after their year in office. Power was distributed through the system. The consuls and magistrates could lead armies, administer territories. The Senate guided foreign policy, controlled the public budgets, and the popular assemblies controlled elections, ratified laws, and decided honors and punishments. This is not to say everyone in the system was equal or that they got along. The Romans believed in collective freedom, but not, as the Athenians had, in individual equality. The only sense in which Romans were equal was that no one was above the law. After this, the core Roman principle was not equality, but a dynamic and competitive hierarchy. When the Senate debated, the oldest senator went first, then the second oldest, then the next oldest, etc. And if you were a young Roman and you wanted a political career, you had to climb what they called the cursus honorum, the ladder of honors, first winning election to be questor, then aedile, and so on up to consul. Every year you would have to make speeches in the forum, shake hands, convince everyone how wonderful you were, make big promises, tear down your opponents. If this sounds familiar, it's because the Romans invented the political campaign. Now, on election day 2, the principle of hierarchy was front and center. One man, one vote was not a thing in ancient Rome. If you were a citizen, you voted in one of 35 tribes. The richest people in your tribe went first, and whichever candidate carried the most tribes, not the most votes, was elected for that year. This was not Athenian-style democracy where all citizens had an equal vote and power rotated by lottery. In Rome, power was decided by elections, and the rich and famous formed a permanent political elite. When a consul died, his death mask, called an imago, was placed in the atrium of his family home, lit from behind by a candle that would be tended for all time. The sons of these families every day would come into their houses and see the death masks of their glorious ancestors, calling on them to be inspired to similar acts of political greatness. This system was intensely competitive, and everywhere there was tension. Elections made losers as well as winners. The old families, the patricians, tried to make laws to protect their status, opposed by the poorer families, the plebeians, many of whom were eventually folded into the elite. There was no fixed Roman constitution. Powers were in flux and in constant negotiation. And when tensions built up and came to a head, that's when all sides had to negotiate. And often a new office, like the tribune of the people, representative of the common people with power to veto any unjust laws, would be created. Now, the Romans could be very violent to the point of genocide to the people they conquered. But inside the city walls, intramuros, there was a sacred rule. No force, no violence, only persuasion, negotiation, compromise. And for 3 centuries, this strange system of hierarchies and distributed power worked astonishingly well. But by the end of the 100s BCE, Rome had won a vast empire. They had defeated Carthage, turned Sicily and Spain into provinces, extended their dominance over Greece and Asia Minor. But the political system that had made the world's first republic a global dominant power was coming apart. The senators who had led conquering armies to further and further lands spent more and more of the riches from these wars on themselves. And the soldiers who fought in the legions, who were going further and further away from their farms, came back and found that they had been turned into slave plantations run by those same rich senators. Many of them flocked into the city of Rome, which exploded in population from a few thousand to nearly 1 million people of increasingly desperate poor. Returning from one of these wars to the depopulated countryside was a young aristocrat named Tiberius Gracchus. He was, according to Plutarch, moved to tears. He said, "The wild animals of Italy have their dens. Each of them has a place to rest, but those who fight and die for Italy have nothing, nothing except the air and the light. Houseless and homeless, they roam the land with their children and wives. They fight and die to protect the rich and luxurious lifestyle enjoyed by others. These so-called masters of the world have not one clod of earth that they can call their own. The gap between rich and poor in Rome had grown into a chasm, and the Republic's ruling class was no longer in the mood to negotiate. When Gracchus was elected tribune for 133 BCE, he passes a law to redistribute public land to the poor, and the Senate buys off one of his fellow tribunes to block it. Gracchus tries to depose that tribune and run again for office to implement his new reform. On election day, the Senate accuses him of trying to be another King Tarquin, sends a mob to the forum, murders Tiberius and hundreds of his allies, throws their bodies in the river. And thus 3 centuries of intense but nonviolent politics come to an end, and Rome's era of civil wars begin. This is the world into which the young Cicero was born. Now, traditionally, there were 3 ways to make it in Roman politics. You had to be born in a famous family like a Claudius or a Julius, be an incredibly talented soldier, or make a lot of money. Marcus Tullius Cicero, Cicero from Latin for chickpea, had exactly none of those 3. His friends, incidentally, probably called him Cicero, but we soften in English the Latin C. So little Cicero, or Cicero, is born in the countryside of Arpinum, about 100 kilometers from Rome, into a respectable local family with a few modest connections. It was obvious from a young age that Cicero's destiny would not be at the head of a legion. Slender, thoughtful, obsessed with books, young Marcus is sent to Rome to study with Quintus Mucius Scaevola, an elderly expert in Roman law. In the house of Scaevola, the boy masters the twists and nuances of the law with astonishing speed. He learns Greek philosophy at the feet of the Stoic Diodotus and the even more impressive Philo of Larissa, inheritor and head of Plato's Academy and a refugee in Rome. In addition to his love of books, Cicero is burning with a desire to join the adventure of Roman politics. But with no famous ancestors, he would have to do this as a novus homo, a new man whose principal weapons were a creative mind and an agile tongue. Cicero would become the greatest debater, would make the most witty, memorable, devastating speeches that any Roman had ever heard. Yeah, he was not the only young talent in Rome, however. In particular, another handsome and intelligent boy, a few years younger than Cicero, was starting to be talked about. A young man named Gaius Julius Caesar. So Cicero would have to compete to find his own way to win and climb the ladder of honors all the way to the top. But in this age, after the murder of Tiberius Gracchus, being a political loser often meant ending up dead. So how does Cicero, a man with no legions, no fortune, no famous family, survive and rise to the top of Rome's republic? How will he use his incredible gifts to save the republic? This is where my book begins. Cicero starts his ascent in the year 70 BC by picking a legal fight he is almost certainly going to lose. He had just returned from service as a junior official in Sicily, where the Roman governor, a odious man by the name of Gaius Verus, is engaged in a massive campaign of extorting the locals. But Verus is highly connected, and putting him on trial would require convincing a jury of Verus's peers, in this case, senators, many of whom made their fortunes in exactly the same way. The 36-year-old Cicero is outraged by this, and he sees an opportunity. He will gather all the evidence and prosecute Verus for his crimes against the public. Instead of appealing to a pedigree he doesn't have, Cicero makes a new kind of appeal. He says that Verus and all other corrupt officials must be punished because this is Voluntas Populi Romani, the will of the Roman people. And this speech is the very first appearance of the phrase, the will of the people, in the whole record of ancient history. Now, where does this idea come from? And what in the world is Cicero trying to do with it? Voluntas, will, volonté, was already a very old term in Roman law. Before Cicero, it referred to the intent of someone with the proper status to make something happen in the world. It's linked etymologically to volo, I fly. So it has this onrushing quality coming out of me, going into the world. A father, paterfamilias, could have a voluntas to give property to his second son. The Senate could have a collective voluntas to make a treaty. But Cicero learns another meaning of the word, which comes from his training as an orator. In this sense, voluntas also means what we call goodwill, meaning what an audience, the favor of an audience that it gives to one speaker that can be shifted to another speaker in a debate. This kind of will, this kind of voluntas is very powerful, but it can be manipulated. It can be misled. Cicero makes the will of the people his political base. He has no legions, no fortune. So instead, he must convince his adversaries that the entire people of Rome stand behind him. Now, is he the first politician to try that kind of move? Probably not. But Cicero makes at least two very important innovations. First, he makes this populist-sounding argument against the populists. Literally, the word populist comes from populares, the people who were fighting for the people in this time in Roman history, or at least they said. Caesar said the same thing. Now, Cicero thinks the senators should not be overthrown. The senatorial elite should rule Rome. They should just be a little bit less blatantly violent and corrupt. Second, Cicero thinks that harnessing the insights of Greek philosophy doesn't mean getting rid of old Roman tradition, that in fact, Plato, Aristotle, the Stoics can justify and rejuvenate Roman traditions. Rome, after all, became master of Greece and not the other way around. So Cicero transforms voluntas from a simple legal term into a powerful political idea. The will of a magistrate or an assembly is not just their desire, their intent. It's a lawful political force in balance, in a stable and rational equilibrium. The will of one consul or senator balanced against the other, and the will of the people, announced in their votes on election day, remains in force all year round. This is Cicero's innovation. The people's will, he says, is fundamental to a free republic, but it can be manipulated by populists, and so it is fallible. It needs virtuous, rational statesmen like himself to guide and enact what the common people cannot, should not do for themselves. With this strategy, Cicero, the new man, rises to the top of Roman politics. He is elected consul of Rome in his year, that is to say, the first year he can be eligible for consul, 63 BC. And in that year, he uncovers and defeats an attempted coup d'etat led by an election loser, the bankrupt aristocrat Catiline. Elections were very expensive then, as now. This moment is the greatest moment in Cicero's life. He is proclaimed father of his country. But his agile tongue and his handling of this crisis wins him as many enemies as it does allies. And in 59 BC, the year his childhood acquaintance Caesar wins the consulship, a tribune named Clodius passes a bill for Cicero's exile. As Caesar's power grows through the 50s BC, first as consul, and then as head of the legions in Gaul, conquering this very city where we sit tonight, Cicero is shoved in and out of the political spotlight. Caesar actually invites Cicero to join a cabal of the most powerful Romans, himself, Pompey the Great, and Crassus, the richest man in Rome. But Cicero, loyal to the Republic's traditions, says no. These three men, the triumvirate, would run Roman politics for the next decade, a further blow to the old system of rotating power, until Pompey and Caesar turn against one another. Caesar crosses the Rubicon, and the Republic enters its final crisis. It is in this period, out of the political game, that Cicero writes his two masterpieces, De Republica and De Legibus, on the Republic and on the laws. These texts, in the form of Platonic dialogues, are meant to show his fellow senators, and especially Rome's younger generation of leaders, what the Republic really is and how they can put it back together. And Plato, whose own Republic Cicero knew by heart, is sitting above his shoulder as he writes. Like Plato, Cicero knows in his heart that reason, the eternal truths philosophy can reveal to us, is the only foundation of a just city. And so his character Scipio argues in De Republica, in the history of Rome, it is by reason, specifically the far-sighted prudence of its early statesmen, that Rome became master of the world. Rome is special, moreover, in that the creation of this republic was not the work of a single great founder, like in many Greek cities. The republic, Cicero writes, was made by the genius not of one, but of many. Non unius esset ingenio, sed multorum. Generations of statesmen who each added to Rome's collective intelligence. Now, how was this intelligence organized? Here, the spirit of Aristotle peeks over Cicero's shoulder. For 2 centuries, since Aristotle's Politics, many had argued that the wisest and most stable form of government was not a monarchy, an aristocracy, or a democracy, but a blend of all three, a so-called mixed constitution. The Greek historian Polybius, writing in Rome just before Cicero's birth, argues that Rome's republic shoots to the top precisely because of its mix of powers between the consuls, the kingly power, the Senate, and the people's assemblies, each of whom could check and balance the other. But in the years since Polybius, divisions in Roman society had gotten massively worse. Cicero does not want a system of checks and balances. He has his own idea. His problem is this: Rome's most sacred civic value is libertas, collective freedom. A Roman can never become the slave of a tyrant. And yet, Cicero believes just as strongly in Rome's ladder of honors, with a wise and virtuous Senate firmly in control. As he says, citizens should be weighed, not counted. To solve this dilemma, freedom from domination and a hierarchy of honors, in a brilliant flash of insight, he takes Roman law and Greek philosophy and fuses them together. For centuries in Roman law, if you couldn't manage a piece of property, you could name a trustee, someone trustworthy to manage the property on your behalf while you formally remained its legal owner. Now, Cicero takes this Roman legal idea of trusteeship and makes it his constitutional cornerstone. Res publica, res populi, declares Scipio. The republic is literally the people's property. No division of power, no checks and balances. The republic, all of it, is owned by the citizens, all of them. But something so precious requires special skill to manage it, the skill of a statesman, an orator, a class of educated men. And here again is Plato. Rome's republic is the ideal form of government because while the people own the republic, it's the wisest, most virtuous citizens that actually hold the rudder of state. Power is not divided, checked, or balanced. It's unified and lies in the Senate's hands. Rome's senators are Plato's philosopher kings. And the glue that holds this system together, that gives it its energy and legitimacy, is voluntas populi, the people's will. The people's ownership of the republic. Their collective freedom is manifest in their free choice once a year on election day. But their will, the legitimacy of the system, remains in force all year round while the Senate governs. In this dialogue, Cicero fashions an argument, creates an argument the world had never seen, that the best form of government is a free and sovereign people with the right to vote, but not to participate, governed by an elected elite. And if all of this is starting to sound a little familiar, it should. But there's a problem Cicero can't quite resolve. He's argued that the reason why the Senate must be principal authority in Rome is because only an educated person can understand the eternal truth necessary to govern. But in Cicero's system, this special elite is not identified by birth and sent off to a special barracks like in Plato's Republic. They're elected by the common people. But if the common people are totally unfit to govern and must therefore be kept from the levers of power, how can those very same people be counted on to elect the right candidate? How can people without education and experience have any judgment worth listening to? Here's how Cicero tries to cut this Gordian knot. For the great orator, whose signature skill is the art of speech, the interdependence of Senate and people is enacted in one place above all, the interplay of a speaker and his audience. to win over an audience, to win their voluntas, their goodwill. An orator doesn't lecture the people in Stoic philosophy. He, quote, relies on the language of everyday life and the usages approved by sensus communis, that is, the body of phrases, stories, references, and jokes that form the community's common sense. The masses cannot govern, but they know a good speaker from a bad one. And Cicero thinks if the Senate can just get rid of the criminals in its own ranks, the virtues of an orator will shine through in their speeches and be recognized and affirmed by the people in their votes. Orator philosophers co-construct the people's will. It's a clever argument. I'll let you decide for yourself whether you think Cicero got it right. Maybe Cicero himself wasn't convinced. De Legibus is the last work of constitutional theory we know of in the ancient world. And it was apparently never finished because, as Cicero writes, Caesar casts the die, crosses the Rubicon, and has himself named dictator, first for 10 years, then for life. With Caesar in power, Cicero turns again to write philosophy, this time taking on a darker set of questions. Not how to save and stabilize the republic, but rather how can each of us, how can any of us live a good life in a world where the republic has died? Once again, his creativity bears marvelous fruit, and once again, Plato and the Stoics help unlock a Roman problem. Freedom has been lost on the battlefield, Cicero writes, but it can never be taken away from the human soul. In each of us is that same struggle between our selfish desires and what reason tells us is right, between our impulses and our better judgments, between despair at an unfair world and the strength that allows us to go on living. In this little text of 44 BC, De Fato, Cicero argues against the idea that our fate could be decided for us in a physical universe of cause and effect, and therefore that a truly happy life is out of our hands. Such determinism, he writes, would, quote, rob the human mind of libera voluntas. Here again, Cicero gives us a new phrase. The human faculty to make choices worthy of our highest selves, what he calls free will. 4 centuries later, Cicero's greatest reader in antiquity, the man we call St. Augustine of Hippo, would develop Cicero's phrase into a central principle of Christian thought. And whether free will exists is still debated today in conferences on complexity and artificial intelligence. But in its first ever appearance, free will is Cicero's phrase to locate inner peace in the ashes of his republic. That republic, as you may know, kept its empire as it lost its freedom. Julius Caesar is murdered on the Senate floor on the Ides of March, 44 BC. His nephew and heir, the young, brilliant Octavian, at first fights his uncle's right-hand man, Mark Antony, for control of Caesar's legacy and against the forces of his assassins, Brutus and Cassius. For a last hopeful moment, the 62-year-old Cicero returns to his former place as leader of the Senate, making forceful speeches against Mark Antony and steering Rome's government as the legions bathe in blood. Cicero tries to mentor the 19-year-old Octavian, but this new Caesar turns against him and joins forces with Antony, one of whose conditions is that Cicero be put to death. And so, the once bookish boy and defender of the dying republic must face his own death with courage, reportedly sticking his own neck out of the carriage as his executioners surround him. Not long after, Octavian turns on Antony as well, as the much more sympathetic Cleopatra, defeating them both in a naval battle in 31 BC. And 4 years later, Octavian takes a new title, Augustus. Emperors would rule Rome's empire for another 500 years. And in the east, right up until the Ottomans take Constantinople in 1453. Which brings us back to our own time, or nearly. The 55 Americans negotiating in the hot summer of 1787 were steeped in the classics and in the work of one man in particular, Rome's greatest orator and master of its language. To be educated in the 18th century, in fact, until very recently, was to know Latin. And the speeches and letters of Cicero were still touchstones in popular culture. The revolutionaries of Boston and Philadelphia wrote essays under the names Gracchus and Brutus. But the gentlemen of Philadelphia, with a few radical exceptions, were not Democrats. The legacy of Athens was the mob, was the unjust seizure of property and foreign wars. The legacy of the Res Publica, on the other hand, was freedom from tyranny, the rule of law, elected magistrates guided by a wise Senate. James Madison and his coalition of gentlemen make their choice. The American people will be sovereign, but they will not govern. Instead, in the new US Constitution, in which the word democracy does not appear, a wise and virtuous elite, not an aristocracy of birth, as in Europe, but as Thomas Jefferson puts it, a natural aristoi, will compete for votes, and the winners steer the ship of state. These trustees would be specially educated in great universities, where they would learn law and political science. The participation of the average citizen, that is to say 99% of us, would be limited to voting and complaining. And a deserving elite would take care of the rest. And so, Cicero's Republic, 18 centuries after Caesar buries it, finally comes to life. In 1948, with America and its allies victorious over fascism, the 58 members of the new United Nations adopt the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which states that, quote, the will of the people shall be the basis of the authority of government, and that this will is expressed in periodic and genuine elections. The sovereign nation state is the first political idea to reach every corner of earth, and the will of the people, Cicero's idea, in nearly the exact form he first expressed it, is its criterion. But we know that the promise of Cicero's model of a free people led by a wise and virtuous elite has never truly been realized. And this is where I'd like to conclude. Every day, we find new evidence that the model of elitist republics is not fit for the problems of this century. Climate change, migration, pandemics. No one person or even group of experts, Kanye West, also a major problem of our era, no one person or even group of experts could possibly gather the information necessary to track these problems, much less solve them. The solutions that work the best against these problems are ones that tap into collective intelligence, that is, the observations, talents, ideas, and energies of all of us, And from Taiwan's network of civic hackers to France's Convention Citoyenne pour le Climat, we are seeing more every day how citizens, if given access to the right tools, good information, organized effectively, will produce smarter, more durable solutions in collaboration with government than when government closes the door to them. And the science, the new science of CI that we're developing at our school in Morocco, is revealing how diverse crowds can outperform small bodies of experts, even those, and it pains me to say it, with philosophy PhDs. Voters may not all read Plato, but they know when they're being ignored and neglected. And when that door stays closed, we have seen how some will try to take down the system, either by voting for parties and ideas the establishment warns them against, Brexit, Trump, Front National, or by crossing that sacred line and using violence to overthrow the system, including in the capital of the American Republic, my hometown, in 2021. So that's our choice. Elitist republics that could collapse again into violence as it did in Cicero's day, or a new model that puts the intelligence of citizens at its center. I'll say working in a place like Morocco and living in a place like France gives me hope, because we're seeing the glimpses of a new model. This is something that we're still working on, that is emerging. But in these new methods and new tools, I find echoes of those ancient words of Cicero, non unius esset ingenio, sed multorum, from the genius not of one, but of many. So inspired by Cicero's creativity, his love of books, and his faith that politics can be, must be remade for the better, I hope we can each do our part to make this idea a reality. Gratias vobis ago. Shukran, merci.
Well, I have many questions, but I think in the interest of following the will of Lex into the audience, we really must go straight to audience questions. Are there any sparked by the presentation?
You could get it going with one question.
I could get it going. So out of your presentation, Lex, I was mostly struck, I mean, and reading the book too, this is a reflection of my personal interest, but your reference to the darker set of questions, which is to say, the way that Cicero puts freedom and will together for the first time. Can you tell us more about his conception of free will? He was the first person to use it later in his life, and how his use of it was actually responding to things that were happening politically in the moment.
Yeah, so it's really interesting if you read about the science and philosophy of the first century BC, is that a lot of these questions we're dealing with now about how much room do we have to decide the course of our lives when our DNA and our culture determine so much of what we do, our psychology, our neuroscience, et cetera. These were questions that the ancient Greeks and Cicero's generation of bilingual Greek and Latin speakers were also grappling with. And so you have theories like Epicurus's theory about atoms. And in Epicurus's theory about that the universe is made from atoms, and so we shouldn't be afraid of death because it's all just material that comes together and falls apart again, how could we possibly have any room for choice in our lives when everything that we do is determined by cause and effect? Well, Lucretius, who is a writer living at the same time in Rome as Cicero, writes a poem called De Rerum Natura, and he says that what happens is that the atoms fall, but they kind of swerve a little bit. And those of you saw Stephen Greenblatt's book, The Swerve, is about this idea that if an atom kind of goes a little bit out of its path, that creates the space for free will, for some kind of freedom. And Cicero thinks that's nonsense, right? It's how could something that's supposed to go in one direction swerve? And so he writes this book, De Fato, essentially to refute the Epicureans, but also to take to task to criticize the Stoics, who also think that the world is physical and that therefore it's governed by physical rules. And their explanation for how we could have any choice in our lives, he also finds problematic. And so Cicero returns to Plato, who had always insisted that our souls move themselves. The reason why our souls never die is because the human soul, the psyche, is an entity in the world that moves itself. And that makes us different from all the animals. And so Cicero uses that idea that the soul moves itself to break out of this chain of cause and effect. And whereas the Greeks had used the phrase epheimoi, what depends on me, they didn't use the word freedom. Cicero knows that this is really about freedom, or he's writing in a time when freedom is critically at stake. And he thinks the Epicureans are a threat to the Roman idea of freedom. And so he puts that word liber and libertas out front. And so we have for the first time the phrase free will in his writing De Fato and in the poem by Lucretius. And very few people have remarked on this. Most people look at free will as something that comes in the Christian era, especially with Augustine, and that Augustine somehow got this from the Stoics. But Augustine didn't read Greek. He didn't understand Greek. He didn't want to read Greek. He read Latin, and he loved Cicero. And so, and kind of was a little bit of a detective story, but I put the pieces together and realized that actually Cicero is the main influence on St. Augustine, who is the main influence on Christianity, and thus the main influence on all Western thought who comes after him.
But there's a personal side to this, right? Because he's writing the De Fato in exile, and he's trying to come to terms with essentially personal political failure. So you write that, he says actions should be judged not by results alone, but by the will behind them. And he writes to Atticus in exile, I shall never regret my will, merely the course I adopted. To what extent does this coupling of freedom and will help him come to terms with the end of his life?
Yeah, that's one of the things I argue in the book, is that sometimes when you look at these ancient texts, you try to just like draw a box around them and say, what does this text mean? Whereas with Cicero, because we have access to 800 of his letters letters to and from his best friend, letters to and from his wife, talking about dinner party he was at with Cleopatra and Julius Caesar. I mean, we have more access to Cicero's inner life than literally any human being in all of human history up until about the Middle Ages, right? So, I mean, we know way more about Cicero's inner life than we know about Shakespeare's, for example, right? Tons more. And because we have his letters, and he is writing at this time of great crisis, personally, and for the Republic. And he is trying to say that, look, I didn't save the day, right? Caesar did win, but I still feel comfortable that I did everything that I could do, that I had the right will. Even if I didn't have the right impact on the world, I had everything that I could control, which was the right intention and the best actions I could do. Is that enough? I don't know, but you can see why the great crisis of his life was also incredible food for his philosophy, and gave us some of the deepest, most moving texts that even today, his work on old age has just been republished and people are quoting it online. And so his works later in life under Caesar as dictator actually are some of the most beautiful works of philosophy that I know.
Right. So this is the other piece that interested me in this dark time, this darker set of questions, is his De Officiis. Can you tell us about that work, again written later, and his conception of this four persona?
Yeah. So this is probably the book that, if you were studying Latin, if you were studying Cicero anytime in the last couple hundred years, it's the one work that everybody knew, that everybody quoted. They knew the speeches against Catiline when Caesar was consul, and they knew the De Officiis of 43 BC. It was his last great work. De Officiis means on duties, basically, it's how it's translated. And he takes this an idea from Stoic philosophy called the four personae. The word persona comes from the word for a mask in theater. So our word person comes from a Latin word that means the mask that you wear in a theater. And there are two ways of thinking about that. A mask is something that we think maybe is artificial. So the mask is not the real you. It's like the part you have to play. But a mask is also, in the ancient theater, what distinguishes you from others. Like, you have a mask if you're a king, a mask if you're a warrior, a mask if you're a wife or a bride or an old man. And so the role that you play has a positive sense, that what's appropriate for a king is not appropriate for a baker, and what's appropriate for a baker is not appropriate for a king. And so the Stoics had this idea that you have four roles that you play in life. One is a universal role that every human being has. It's the role of reason, meaning we all have the ability to reason, and that's what connects us to the order of the universe. That was the Stoic kind of main principle, the logos. The second role is the character you're born with at birth. So some people are more timid, some people are more aggressive. You're born with at birth, and the best thing you can do is to try to reinforce what's good about your character and maybe mitigate some of your vices. So that's the second role. The third role is the role of chance. What happens to you in your life? You win an election, you lose an election. You get a business, you lose a business. And then you're trying to respond to these chaotic events in the most reasonable way that you can. And then finally, he says, there's a role that we choose for ourselves, a voluntate proficitur, which means that comes out of your will. And that there's this final role that is the path that you choose for yourself in life. It can be your career, but it can also be your friends. Which friends do you spend time with more than others? And so I find in this idea of roles something very rich and nuanced, that it's not just about the role is like the fake part, and I have a real side of me that no one gets to see. It's also, we're always playing roles in every friendship and every job that we have. We're trying to inhabit something the world expects from us. Right now I'm playing the role of a speaker at an event, and I'm trying to do things that I think you would expect from me as a speaker. Is that wrong? Does it mean I'm fake? No, it means I'm trying to do something that allows us to have a relationship. So this is what Cicero is trying to say. Some of these things we control, some of these things we don't. And the thing that is most precious is that fourth role, the role that comes from our will.
Can you tell us too about how these four roles relate to the ethic of decorum, which is not an ethic that we necessarily uphold or really understand today? What is decorum, and how do these roles relate to it?
So decorum basically means appropriate action. And so Stoics again had this idea that there's a logos, there's an eternal justice that everyone should try to achieve, but that how you act every day, it depends on where you are in the world. It depends on the role you play in society. And so decorum you could look at as the courteous, the correct, the decent thing to do in any situation, which is what made De Officia such a popular book among like the gentlemen of the 18th century and 19th century, because it was all about how to choose the appropriate action when you're thrust into a new situation, something complicated, something embarrassing or difficult. How do you act with decorum? How do you act in such a way that's honorable, that is decent? And the book is, Cicero's book is can you ever act in a decorous way just for yourself, meaning just in a out of your self-interest? And he argues no, that the only way to be truly decorous is to act in the interest of justice, of the greater reason of the universe. So that might change depending on your situation, but decorum requires you to be in tune with the situation, in tune with the universe. So it's a clever idea, decorum.
Well, in other words, and you wrote this, that public service is the service to one's highest self.
Yeah, and another thing that looks very strange to us looking at the politics of the ancient world is that we think that politics is like something that this group of people over here do and that we can complain about. Whereas for Cicero and for Plato and Aristotle, politics is the realization of your highest self. Now raise your hand if you just think coming into this room that politics is the realization of your highest self. No hands went up. Okay, so yeah, maybe Alice. So
the book.
It's not what we're taught to believe. But if we were in the house of Cicero or in the house of Plato or Aristotle, every single one hand in this room would have gone up. And so I think it's a failure of politics as we know it, and the failure of our education system as we know it, to teach us that public service in politics is the responsibility, the duty, the pleasure of every active mind. But we still have some work to do.
You have a great, we'll end here and we'll open to audience questions. You have a great sentence I wanted to read on this exact point that's really moved me, and it's a beautiful point in the book. Upholding politics as an arena of self-mastery, Cicero wants readers to understand that the purposes of the self and those of the city may be achieved together. Can we have another round of applause, please? And there's a question. Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you for the excellent talk. You talked a little bit about the importance of money to politics in the Roman world, and about the power of aristocracy that it played in the political system. And I wonder, with what we're seeing today, where every American election costs more money, whether there's any lessons that you take from Cicero for the current system. And one could make a case that perhaps sometimes business interests stand against the collective will. How would you say Cicero saw them as sort of intertwined or standing against each other?
It's a great question. I think any reading of Roman history says that if you can't deal with money, and especially a system that grows wealthier and wealthier, political rules can't stay the same. And to me, you can't read Roman history and not see that as Rome got richer and richer, its political system did not manage the stress of all of this money and all of these slaves and all of this land, right? That as Rome defeated Carthage, its ancient enemy, Scipio Aemilianus, the general that defeats Carthage, allegedly stood on the ruins of Carthage and wept because he knew that now the next city to be destroyed was his own, right? That Rome was master of the world, so that Rome, the only threat to Rome would be the Romans. So I think any fair reading of Roman history says that you have to constantly update and adapt rules. And for example, the absolute failure of the American political system to regulate money and politics has led to an incredible distortion of the information environment, an incredible distortion of the partisan environment, so that there's no middle, there's no rational, moderate middle in the man. I can speak as someone who worked in the American Congress. So it's a crisis. It's a crisis. And the European system has done better, I would say, but it's still a long way to go. Unfortunately, Cicero has a blind spot about reform. He wants Rome. He's honest. He's not corrupt. No one ever accused Cicero of corruption. But he thinks reform leads to mob violence. He's against distributing public land to poor people. He thinks people should know their place. And that's really frustrating. It makes me really angry with Cicero. And when like Cicero was invented on generative AI a couple weeks ago, and I could talk to Cicero for the first time, I was like, Cicero, like, tell me, like, why is it that you were so against reform? And like, he called the murder of Tiberius Gracchus a great act. And I was like, I was like, finally I get to ask Cicero. And he had some decently good answers to defend himself, but that's for another time.
First of all, congratulations and thank you. That was really, really great. I had somehow never actually made this direct link in my mind between Cicero and the American Constitution, actually. But I have two small interconnected questions, because actually at the end you talk about collective intelligence and you emphasize that, but actually I feel like what you're describing is actually democracy and the structures and processes and institutions that are needed to allow and enable collective intelligence to emerge are in fact democratic institutions. And as you quite rightly point out, what we have today is not actually democracy. And I'm curious about at what point was it that we started calling what we have today democracy? I've been trying to do some of the digging into this myself, and I'm not even entirely sure, because as you say, we've anchored it in the UN Declaration on Human Rights. But and I think that's why we think of elections as democratic, but that doesn't make them democratic. And I don't know, I'm curious if you know about this.
It's kind of like a hiccup, right? That sometime between 1789 and 1830, the word democracy went from being a curse word to something universally embraced, at least in America, not over Europe, of course, but and so, as I say, in the Constitution, U.S. Constitution, you can do a Control F. The word democracy does not appear. 0 appearances, right? America is founded as a republic. It remains a republic, not a democracy. The citizens elect other people to govern for them. Now, sometime between Jefferson and Andrew Jackson, the battlefield of American reform is now about who gets to vote. It's not about citizen power. Yes, there are juries, there are grand juries, there's some pushback that citizens have the right to participate in making law. But most of the battle is who gets to vote. And so as the people on the Jeffersonian side are pushing for more and more people to be able to vote, in this case men with property, but they want that property requirement to be lower and lower, so more and more people can vote. They were called the Democratic Republicans, the Republicans or the Democratic Republicans with a hyphen. And so the other side, the Federalists, they are for people of property and wealthy people to have most of the control. They were the more the Ciceronian side of things. And they disappear after the 1816 election, basically. And then you have the rise of this figure who is not defending citizen power to govern, but defending universal right to vote, Andrew Jackson, his political partner in crime, Martin Van Buren. They win the election of 1824. And now you have this new thing called the Democratic Party, of which I was a member, still am. But I'm more of a small d Democrat than a large D Democrat these days. And so Alexis de Tocqueville comes from this city to America to write about La démocratie en Amérique in the 1830s, which would not have been possible in the 1790s. But in that 40-year period, the people who propose more voting rights are called Democrats. But it's just about voting. And so the idea of democracy in the 19th century becomes linked to who votes, not how much power citizens have, but where do you draw the lines of who gets to vote? And that's why we call ourselves democracies today, wrongly, incorrectly, right? Complete aberration from history, because citizens in France and America don't govern themselves. We elect other people to govern. It's a very simple difference. And yet we still mistakenly call ourselves democracies. None of us have ever lived in a democracy. But as Gandhi once said about Western civilization, I think it would be a good idea.
Very good. We have 2 questions on Zoom that are essentially asking the same point, and then I'll go back to this and final in-person question. Lex will be around after, by the way, of course, to continue to talk and talk and talk. Natalie Hobbs says, it is difficult to see how the transition to more collective intelligence as a form of governance works without revolution or social unrest, as it requires the elected governance to cede some of their power, which they are unlikely to do easily. Any thoughts, Lex, on how to achieve peaceful change?
Yes. I spend all day, every day, kind of thinking about questions like this. The problem with revolution as we've seen in 1917, 1949, 1789, violence leads to more violence. It's not like you can have one violent revolution and be, okay, everybody, put your guns down, and now we're going to be peaceful. Violence always leads to more violence. That's what history shows us. So that's why I'm against violent revolution. I respect people's right to protest. In France, I think we can debate how effective that right of protest is in 2023, but I respect people who believe in radical change, but not radical violent change, because I don't think radical violent change ever achieves its ends. So the question is, how do you achieve your ends non-violently? I think you have to always have three things. There are three things that are critically important for systemic political change. One is you need good leaders. And I'm thinking now of people like Martin Luther King, who was born in a world where Black people had very few rights in America, and who had a combination of creativity, strategic ability, a communication ability. We need lots of those leaders, number one. Number two, we need a mass movement, right? Leaders who create the conditions for many, many people to participate. And you need an opportunity, a moment, what the Greeks called a kairos, right? Where the window of opportunity opens, like in 1933, Great Depression, people were saying that a fascist leader should take over America. Franklin Roosevelt is elected and creates a radically different kind of welfare state that America never had before, creates Social Security, creates all kinds of new progressive laws. There are opportunities. And so those three things is what's required for social and political change. Good leaders, a mass movement, and an eye for the right moment, the right political opportunity. It's not easy, but it's the only thing that's ever changed politics for the better.
I think we have time for one more. Yes.
Yes, thank you very much for your talk and for the answers for your questions. So I'm very intrigued by your remark that Cicero sort of coined the expression or invented the notion of free will for the first time. So I'd like to know a little bit more about that. And in particular, you mentioned at different points during the evening that Cicero sort of pushed back against the my neurons, the
Populists?
No, the
Epicureans?
Epicureans. Thank you very much.
Sure.
But then later on, you talked about the Epicureans, and their fourth mask was the path you choose for yourself. So
Stoics.
how is this not free will?
Good point. Okay, so the four personas from the Stoics and from a guy named Panaetius. Cicero has a very so you have three basically important schools at this time in Greek philosophy. You have the Stoics, which are maybe the most popular. You have the Epicureans, who preach kind of dropping out of politics, go have a picnic with your friends. If you've read De Rerum Natura or Stephen Greenblatt's book on this, it's a very attractive philosophy. And you have what are called the skeptics. These are the inheritors of Plato's Academy, but Plato's Academy had turned from this dogmatic academy about forms and eternal forms and to knowing that we know nothing, right? The skeptical, more Socratic version of the academy. So you have the skeptics, the Stoics, and the Epicureans. Cicero thinks the Epicureans have some beautiful poetry, like Lucretius. There's a tradition that Cicero definitely read Lucretius and praised Lucretius's poetry to his brother. We have a letter. There's a tradition that Cicero edited some of De Rerum Natura. So he liked Epicureans personally, but he thought that the Epicureans themselves were an enormous threat because they didn't want to do politics. And to Cicero, politics is the highest realization of the self. So the actual first term, we can date the very first appearance of the word free will, libera voluntas, to Lucretius's poem. But I give Cicero the precedence because in a speech of 70 BC against Verus, he uses the phrase libera voluntates, free wills, in the context of he taking on this case, his wills will be less free afterwards. So technically the first pairing of freedom and will is in a speech by Cicero, but it's really in De Fato where he unpacks what he means by free will, and he's answering the Epicureans. So why is it that the Romans are the first to develop this and not the Greeks? As I say, the Greeks talked about this question of what do we control in our lives in a world that's used, cause and effect is in our brains. How do we have any choice about what we do? But they used a different term. They used the word epheimoi, or it means what's up to us, what depends on us. They didn't use the word eleutheria, which means freedom in Greek. And why didn't they use that word? Well, it's because this is during a time of Alexander the Great, the kings, the people there was no freedom at that time in the Greek world, and so using the term freedom was less favored by the philosophers. So that they talked about what's up to us, what depends on us. But for Romans, freedom is central. You can't get rid of it. This is the key thing. And so that's where libertas enters the debate. So sorry, this is a little esoteric about philosophy and terminology, but I do think that Cicero has been condescended to for about 100 years. People looked at Cicero as like, he's a good speaker, ineffectual, didn't get things done. Caesar was the real kind of can-do, the guy who won. Cicero is kind of like a kooky uncle that couldn't quite get the job done. Whereas only in the last like 20, 30 years is he really getting respect as a thinker and as someone who does original things. And by taking Greek philosophy and translating it into Latin, Cicero's generation, by the way, is the high watermark of bilingualism of Romans who also spoke Greek and spoke Greek fluently. Before that, fewer Romans spoke Greek, and after that, as Latin became the main language of Europe, it declined. So it's this like critical moment, sweet spot where Greek philosophy and the Latin language are kind of encountering each other, and Cicero by far is the central figure in the passage of Greek philosophy into Latin. So that's for those who are interested in the philosophical part of this stuff. But Cicero found himself in a very interesting moment.